The microphone hit the desk with a soft thud that somehow echoed through 40 million American homes. Johnny Carson's hand was shaking. The NBC orchestra froze mid-note. Doc Severinsen's trumpet hung in the air like a question no one wanted to ask. Ed McMahon stopped smiling for the first time in 17 years of television. The studio audience, 400 people who had laughed through an hour of comedy, suddenly couldn't remember how to breathe. Carson looked directly into camera one. His eyes were different. Not the eyes that had delivered 30,000 punchlines. Not the eyes that had made Elizabeth Taylor blush or made Richard Pryor weep with laughter. These were the eyes of a man who had just received a phone call that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice cracked on the word ladies. "I need to stop the show." The year was 1987. Ronald Reagan was president. The Cold War was thawing. Americans were buying VCRs and watching Wall Street in theaters. But on this particular Tuesday night in October, none of that mattered. Because Johnny Carson, the man who had become America's best friend through a television screen, was about to do something no late-night host had ever done before. He was about to give the entire country permission to grieve. But to understand why this moment shattered a nation, we need to go back 6 hours earlier, to a dressing room in Burbank, California, where Johnny Carson sat alone with a letter he couldn't bring himself to open. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stationery, the kind reserved for weddings or funerals. It had arrived by courier at 2:47 p.m., delivered directly to Carson's dressing room at NBC Studio One. His assistant had knocked 3 times before entering, her face pale, her hands trembling as she placed it on his desk. "It's from Nebraska," she whispered, as if saying it louder would make it more real. Carson stared at the envelope for 20 minutes. Outside his door, the machinery of the Tonight Show hummed with its usual chaos. Writers pitched jokes. Producers confirmed guests. The band ran through charts. But inside that room, time had stopped. He knew what the letter said before he opened it. Had known since the phone call at dawn. Had known, perhaps, for the 3 months before that, when the calls from Omaha had become more frequent, more urgent, more filled with the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. His mother was gone. Ruth Carson had raised him in Norfolk, Nebraska, during the Depression. She had worked double shifts at the power company to buy him his first magic set when he was 12. She had sat in the front row of his high school talent show when he performed his first comedy routine, bombing so badly that the principal suggested he stick to football. She had never missed an episode of The Tonight Show in 25 years, even when the local NBC affiliate aired it at 1 in the morning. And now she was gone, and Johnny Carson had a show to do in 4 hours. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The makeup artist noticed it first. Carson's eyes were red-rimmed when he sat in the chair at 5:15 p.m. She had been working with him for 12 years and had never seen him cry. Not when his son Ricky died in a car accident in 1991. Not when his marriage to Joanne fell apart in front of the tabloids. Johnny Carson did not cry in front of people. That was the rule. But tonight, the rule was breaking. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, dabbing foundation under his eyes. "We can cancel. Run a repeat." "No one would." "She wouldn't want that," Carson interrupted, his voice steady but strange, like a man speaking from underwater. "She'd want the show to go on." And so it did. At 5:30 p.m., Carson walked onto the set. The band played the theme. Ed McMahon delivered the introduction with his trademark boom. The audience applauded. The cameras rolled. Everything was normal. Except nothing was normal. Carson delivered his monologue with mechanical precision. The jokes landed. The audience laughed. But anyone watching closely would have noticed the way his hand kept drifting to his jacket pocket, where he had folded the letter from Nebraska into a small square. Would have noticed the way he looked at the audience not with his usual playful spark, but with something that looked like desperate searching, as if he were trying to find his mother's face among the strangers. The first guest was a young actress promoting a sitcom no one remembers. She was nervous, talking too fast, laughing too loud at her own stories. Carson nodded at all the right moments, asked all the right questions. But his mind was elsewhere, 3 states away, in a small house in Omaha where his mother's favorite chair now sat empty. The moment came during the commercial break before the second guest. Carson stood up from his desk, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked out at the audience with an expression no one in that studio would ever forget. The stage manager counted down from the commercial. 5, 4, 3, 2. Carson raised his hand. "Stop," he said. The stage manager froze. The cameras kept rolling, but the operators looked at each other in confusion. Doc Severinsen put down his baton. Ed McMahon leaned forward in his chair, concern flooding his face. "Stop the show," Carson repeated louder this time. The red lights on the cameras flickered. The audience murmured, uncertain if this was part of the act. But then Carson reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, now wrinkled from his nervous hands, and everyone understood that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. "My mother died this morning," Carson said, and 40 million people across America felt their hearts stop. "And I didn't know if I should be here tonight. I didn't know if I could do this show. Because the truth is, I don't know how to be funny right now. I don't know how to make jokes. I don't know how to pretend that everything is okay when the woman who taught me how to laugh is gone." The studio was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a punchline. The profound silence of 400 strangers suddenly bearing witness to something sacred. Carson looked down at the letter in his hands. "This is from my sister," he continued. "She tells me that my mother's last words were about this show. She said, 'Is Johnny going to be okay tonight?' Not tell Johnny I love him. Not tell Johnny goodbye. She wanted to know if the show would be okay." His voice broke on the word okay. Ed McMahon stood up from his chair, tears streaming down his face. Doc Severinsen put his trumpet down and bowed his head. In the control room, the director's hand hovered over the button that would cut to commercial, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. This was something bigger than television. This was something that needed to breathe. "So I want to do something," Carson said, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in his pocket. "For my mother. For everyone watching who has lost someone. I want us to have 3 minutes of silence. No jokes. No music. No applause. Just 3 minutes to remember the people we've loved and lost. 3 minutes to say goodbye." He walked back to his desk, sat down, and folded his hands. The cameras stayed on him. The audience remained frozen. And for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, someone timed it later, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson became something it had never been before. A church. A memorial. A collective exhale. What happened next would change television forever, but not in the way anyone expected. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full of the sound of people crying in Studio One. Full of the sound of 40 million Americans sitting in their living rooms, holding the hands of their spouses, their children, their parents, thinking about their own losses. Full of the weight of grief that everyone carries but rarely speaks about. Carson sat perfectly still. His eyes closed. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths. On his desk, under the bright studio lights, a single tear traced a line down his cheek, catching the light like a diamond. In the control room, phones started ringing. Not angry calls from executives demanding to know why the show had gone off script. Not complaints from advertisers worried about lost commercial time. But calls from viewers, hundreds of them, then thousands, asking for the address to send flowers. Asking for the address to send letters. Asking how they could tell Johnny Carson that he had just given them permission to grieve for their own mothers, their own fathers, their own children. The 3 minutes ended not with Carson speaking, but with Doc Severinsen lifting his trumpet and playing a single, haunting note. Soft. Reverent. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. The note hung in the air for 10 seconds, 15, 20, before fading into silence again. Carson opened his eyes. He looked directly into the camera, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Stronger. Clearer. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for letting me share that with you." The audience erupted. Not with applause, but with something rawer, more primal. The sound of 400 people releasing breath they didn't know they were holding. The sound of collective catharsis. Some were crying. Some were smiling through tears. Some were hugging strangers sitting next to them, united in a moment of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of television. Ed McMahon walked over to Carson's desk, something he had never done in all their years together, and placed his hand on Carson's shoulder. No words. Just presence. Just solidarity. The show continued, but it was different now. The remaining guests were cancelled. Instead, Carson talked. Really talked. About his mother. About growing up in Nebraska. About the magic set she bought him when they could barely afford groceries. About the way she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. About the last conversation they had, 3 weeks before, when she told him she was proud of him, not for being famous, but for staying kind. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The studio audience listened with rapt attention. No one checked their watches. No one whispered to their neighbors. They were no longer an audience. They were a congregation, and Johnny Carson had become their pastor, preaching a sermon about loss and love and the strange grace of being human. When the show finally ended at 1:05 a.m., an hour past its usual time, no one moved. The audience remained seated. The cameras kept rolling. Carson stood up from his desk, walked to the front of the stage, and bowed. Not the theatrical bow of an entertainer, but the humble bow of a man saying thank you to people who had just witnessed his most vulnerable moment. The letter from his sister remained in his pocket. But something else had been added to it during those 3 minutes of silence, thousands of invisible letters from viewers who had written their own goodbyes in their hearts, who had remembered their own mothers, who had finally allowed themselves to cry for losses they had been holding on to for years. The next morning, the New York Times ran a front-page story about the episode. Not in the entertainment section. On the front page. "Carson Stops Time," read the headline. The article described how NBC's phone lines had been overwhelmed with calls. How emergency rooms reported a noticeable decrease in admissions that night, as if the collective grief release had somehow soothed the nation. How therapists across the country would later tell stories of patients citing that episode as the moment they finally began to heal from their own losses. NBC received over 200,000 letters in the weeks that followed. They came from every state, every demographic, every walk of life. Veterans writing about comrades lost in Vietnam. Children writing about grandparents. Parents writing about children taken too soon. And through it all, one common thread: thank you for showing us that it's okay to grieve. Thank you for showing us that we're not alone. Carson kept every single letter. Had them boxed and stored in his garage in Malibu. When he retired from The Tonight Show 5 years later, he donated them to the Smithsonian Institution, where they remain today, a testament to the night television stopped being about entertainment and became about humanity. But perhaps the most profound impact of that night wasn't measured in ratings or letters or headlines. It was measured in the thousands of small, private moments that rippled outward from that 3-minute silence. A father in Michigan who had never told his children about the brother he lost in childhood finally shared the story that night. His kids gathered around him on the couch, holding his hands as he cried for the first time in 40 years. A daughter in Oregon who had been estranged from her mother for a decade picked up the phone and called, and they cried together, and began the long process of reconciliation. A veteran in Texas who had buried his grief about Vietnam so deep he thought it would never surface found himself sobbing in his living room, and his wife held him, and for the first time in 20 years he told her about the friends he'd lost. Carson never spoke about that night again. Not in interviews. Not in his memoir. Not even to Ed McMahon in their final conversation before Carson's death in 2005. But he kept the letter from his sister in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, folded into that same small square, worn soft at the edges from being held. When they cleaned out his Malibu home after he passed, they found it there, along with a handwritten note in Carson's elegant script. October 13, 1987. The night Mom taught me that silence can heal. 3 minutes. That's all it was. 180 seconds in a career that spanned 3 decades and over 4,500 episodes. But those 3 minutes reminded an entire nation of something they had forgotten. That grief doesn't make us weak. That vulnerability isn't failure. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply stop, put down the mask, and let the world see him cry. Johnny Carson gave America many things during his time behind that desk. Laughter. Joy. Comfort. But on that October night in 1987, he gave us something far more precious. He gave us permission to be human.